Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine stepping onto a global stage right after shaking off centuries of colonial rule. The world shattered by war, now instantly dividing into new camps, and you, as a brand new nation, you've got to figure out your place. What principles guide you? What choices do you make when you're facing immense pressure from, well, everywhere?
That really captures the situation India found itself in right at independence.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about domestic challenges. India had to navigate a radically changed international landscape with very little prior experience, as an independent global player.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, India's crucial first steps on the world stage, those foundational years of its external relations. We're drawing on the sources you've shared, which really lay out the challenges and the decisions made.
Right. Our mission here is really to explore this material and understand the key international context India faced, the core principles that guided its foreign policy, and how those principles were, tested and adapted through crucial relationships and major events like the wars it fought.
So you can get a handle on the complex interplay between India's internal situation, what was happening at home, and how it chose to project itself externally during this absolutely critical period.
Stepping into the world post-World War II meant entering a landscape dominated by massive reconstruction efforts, the birth of a wave of new nations emerging from colonialism, and, perhaps most defining, the very beginning of the Cold War. The world was quickly polarizing into blocs led by the United States and the Soviet Union.
And domestically, India was dealing with its own inherited chaos, the trauma and pressures of partition, these lingering international disputes left by the British, and just the overwhelming task of lifting millions out of desperate poverty. These weren't abstract problems. They were constantly influencing foreign policy calculations, weren't they?
Absolutely. Constantly. So India's initial aims in foreign relations were ambitious yet pragmatic, respect for the sovereignty of all nations, and pursuing security primarily through maintaining peace rather than jumping into military power blocks.
And what's striking is how deeply rooted this aim was. You mentioned it's actually in the Constitution.
Yeah, it's embedded right there in the directive principles of state policy, particularly Article 51. That article talks specifically about promoting international peace and security, maintaining just and honorable relations, fostering respect for international law, and encouraging the settlement of international disputes by arbitration. It's quite remarkable.
Wow, writing foreign policy goals right into the foundational document. But the sources also point out a crucial reality for a newly independent, developing country, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you might have these high-minded principles, but you're limited by resources, by economic dependence.
Precisely. That's a key constraint. Developing nations often found they had to pursue more modest international goals, maybe tone things down a bit, and they were inevitably influenced by their dependence on more powerful states for aid, technology, or investment.
Yeah.
That dependence could subtly push them towards aligning with one bloc or the other, regardless of their stated principles. It's a tough spot.
And that dynamic is where India's most famous foreign policy principle comes in. Non-alignment.
Yes, the cornerstone. And it's important to see India's independence not just as a unique event, but as part of a broader global anti-colonial struggle. The Indian independence movement's ideals, its success, actually inspired liberation movements across Asia and Africa.
So its foreign policy was really shaped by both those internal freedom struggle ideals and the external reality of the Cold War, a kind of push and pull.
Exactly. And one figure is absolutely central to navigating this, Jawaharlal Nehru. He held the dual role of prime minister and foreign minister from 1946 all the way through 1964. His vision, his decisions, profoundly shaped India's early international identity.
Wearing two massive hats. So what were his main goals in setting this foreign policy course? What was he aiming for?
According to the sources, Nehru had three clear objectives. First, preserving India's hard-won national sovereignty. Second, protecting its territorial integrity, its borders. And third, promoting rapid economic development, getting the country on its feet.
And non-alignment was the chosen strategy to achieve those three things. How did that work?
Precisely. The core idea was a deliberate decision to stay out of the military alliances being rapidly formed by the U.S. think NATO, CETO, and by the Soviet Union, like the Warsaw Pact. Nehru wanted India to retain its freedom of judgment and action on international issues. Don't get locked in.
Okay, so not picking sides in the big Cold War standoff. That sounds principled, but the sources show it was anything but easy.
Yeah.
Right? It involved some really tricky balancing act.
Oh, a very difficult balancing act indeed. The sources offer a fascinating example from 1956. India took a very strong public stand, even leading international protest against Britain's attack on Egypt during the Suez Crisis, a clear position against what was seen as neo-colonial aggression. Really strong words.
Okay.
But in the very same year, when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, India did not join the widespread public condemnation. It was much more muted.
Wow, that stark contrast really highlights the tightrope they were walking. One stand against a Western power, relative silence, or at least quiet diplomacy on a Soviet action.
It does. And while there were criticisms about the balance, the sources indicate that despite these challenges, India largely did succeed in maintaining independent stances on most international issues. And here's a really interesting practical outcome. By not being exclusively tied to either bloc, India managed to get aid and assistance from both the U.S.-led and Soviet-led camps.
That's a fascinating takeaway.
Yeah.
A non-alignment wasn't just an ideology. It had a tangible economic benefit in leveraging aid from rivals. But I can imagine the U.S. wasn't thrilled with India playing this independent game, especially as ties with the Soviets grew.
No, not at all. The U.S. definitely viewed India's non-alignment with considerable unease, even suspicion. They were wary of India's independent foreign policy initiatives, and the growing partnership India was developing with the Soviet Union during the 1950s, there was definite friction there.
And it wasn't just external pressure, was it? The sources mentioned there was a significant domestic debate within India itself about this policy.
Absolutely. Non-alignment wasn't universally accepted inside India. Groups like the Bharatiya Jana Sangh and later the Swatantra Party, and even respected figures like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, felt that India should align more closely with the U.S.-led bloc. They saw the U.S. as the leader of the democratic world, which India was also building itself to be.
But Nehru held sway.
Pretty much. His political stature and his vision meant he largely set the course. His perspective, captured in a letter from January 1947, even before full independence, was quite revealing. He wrote, "Our general policy is to avoid entanglement in power politics and not to join any group of powers as against any other group. We must be friendly to both and yet not join either." He knew it would be hard, acknowledging that both the U.S. and Russia would be suspicious, but concluded this cannot be held.
That quote really nails the deliberate, even if difficult, nature of the policy. Okay, so staying out of the military blocs was one pillar. Another key aspect of India's early foreign policy was championing Afro-Asian solidarity, wasn't it?
It was a very important pillar, yes. Given India's size, its strategic location, and its, potential as a major new independent nation, Nehru certainly envisioned India playing a significant role on the world stage, particularly in Asia and among newly independent nations. His government actively worked throughout the 1940s and 50s to build ties with these emerging states in Asia and Africa.
And this started really early, even before formal independence, with the Asian Relations Conference.
Yes, that conference in March 1947 was a powerful early symbol of India's commitment to Asian unity. And they weren't just talking. India actively supported Indonesia's freedom struggle against the Dutch in 1949, even convening an international conference to rally support, putting actions behind the words.
India also became a really strong voice against colonialism and racism globally.
Staunchly against both. They were particularly vocal opponents of apartheid in South Africa right from the start. This push for solidarity, it sort of culminated in the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. This is seen as a peak moment of engagement with newly independent nations and a crucial step towards formalizing the non-aligned movement itself.
Which was then formally established at the first NM Summit in Belgrade in 1961, with Nehru as one of the key co-founders alongside leaders like Tito, Nasser, Sukarno, and Nkrumah. It makes sense why C. Rajagopalachari, writing back in 1950, could say India, despite not being a military power, was fast coming to be recognized as the biggest moral power in the civilized world. Her word listened to with respect in the councils of the great. A big claim.
A powerful vision for a young nation indeed. However, alongside these aspirations for peace and solidarity, India also faced very challenging realities with its immediate neighbors. Let's turn to the complex relations with China.
Right. This relationship started quite hopefully after the 1949 revolution, didn't it?
It did. Surprisingly so, perhaps in hindsight. India was actually one of the first countries to recognize the new communist government in China. Nehru felt a connection with China, seeing it as another ancient civilization emerging from foreign domination, and India supported China's entry into international forums like the UN. Nehru himself famously believed future Chinese aggression was exceedingly unlikely.
Though the sources hint that not everyone shared that optimism within India's leadership. Patel, for instance.
True. Vallabhbhai Patel, for instance, expressed early worries about potential future aggression from China, highlighting different strategic perspectives within the leadership even back then. But Nehru's view held sway, and for a long time, India's border with China was mainly patrolled by paramilitary forces, not the army, reflecting that initial trust.
And the friendly phase seemed cemented by the Panchsheel Agreement, the 5 principles.
Yes, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, signed in 1954. Things like mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs. On paper, it looked like a solid basis for trust.
But tensions began to build, centered largely around Tibet.
Tibet was a major flashpoint. China annexed Tibet in 1950, which removed a historical buffer zone between the two countries. While India didn't initially oppose the annexation openly, there was growing unease about reports of the suppression of Tibetan culture.
And India made a crucial concession regarding Tibet in that 1954 Panchsheel Agreement. That seems important.
Yes, that's a key detail from the sources. Through a clause in the 1954 treaty, ostensibly about trade and intercourse with Tibet, India effectively conceded China's claim over Tibet, treating it as a region of China. Now, despite initial Chinese assurances of autonomy for Tibet, an armed uprising against Chinese rule occurred in 1958.
Right.
When the Dalai Lama fled Tibet in 1959 and sought refuge in India, India granted him asylum. This prompted a very strong protest from Beijing, accusing India of allowing anti-China activities from its territory.
That must have been a massive turning point. And then the border dispute really escalated.
It did. The border dispute became prominent around 1960. India maintained that the boundary was settled based on agreements from the colonial era, specifically the McMahon Line in the east, but China disputed this, claiming historical inaccuracies. The main areas of dispute were Aksai Chin in Ladakh in the west, and what is now Arunachal Pradesh, known then as the Northeastern Frontier Agency, or NEFA, in the east.
China wasn't just disputing it on paper. They were physically changing the reality on the ground in Aksai Chin.
Exactly. Between 1957 and 1959, China actually occupied Aksai Chin and built a strategic road right through it, connecting its Xinjiang and Tibet regions. Despite extensive talks at the leadership level, these differences couldn't be resolved, and small border skirmishes started to occur. It was getting tense.
Leading, tragically, to the war in 1962.
Yes, described in the sources as a swift and massive invasion launched by China in October 1962. And talk about geopolitical timing. This happened while global attention was largely absorbed by the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolding between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. A very convenient moment for China, perhaps.
What was the course of the fighting? How did it play out?
Well, China attacked simultaneously in both disputed regions. There was a first wave, capturing key areas in Arunachal, followed by a second wave about a month later. Indian forces managed to hold the line and block advances in the west, in Ladakh, but in the east, in Nefa, the Chinese advanced quite deeply, coming close to the plains of Assam.
And
Then, after about a month of fighting, China declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew its troops back to roughly their original positions before the main invasion.
a relatively short war, but the impact was huge, wasn't it?
Profound and far-reaching, absolutely. It significantly damaged India's international standing and, perhaps even more so, its self-image domestically. India, the champion of non-alignment and peaceful coexistence, was forced to seek military assistance from the Americans and British.
And the Soviets stayed neutral. That must have been a shock, given the growing ties.
It was quite notable, yes. The Soviet Union, with whom India had a growing relationship, remained neutral during the conflict. Domestically, while it induced a sense of national humiliation and led to intense soul-searching, it also paradoxically strengthened nationalistic sentiment. People rallied.
And heads rolled, presumably.
Oh, yes. There were immediate consequences. Changes in army leadership and the resignation of Defense Minister V.K. Krishna Menon, who was widely criticized and seen as being close to Nehru and perhaps out of touch with military realities.
And Nehru himself faced unprecedented criticism.
Yes, he was heavily criticized for his earlier optimistic assessment of Chinese intentions and the apparent lack of military preparedness. For the first time in independent India, a no-confidence motion was moved and debated against his government in the Lok Sabha. The Congress Party also lost some key by-elections, signaling a real shift in the national political mood.
The war even had an impact on the political landscape beyond the ruling party, affecting the communists.
It did. The war, combined with the growing Sino-Soviet ideological rift, directly contributed to the split in the Communist Party of India in 1964. The pro-USSR faction largely stayed with the CPI and gravitated closer to the Congress, while the pro-China faction formed the CPI, Marxist, or CPIM. In fact, many CPIM leaders were arrested immediately after the war, seen as potential security risks due to their perceived pro-China stance.
And it fundamentally changed how India viewed its northeast region, too.
Absolutely. The war exposed the volatile situation and the challenges of integrating the remote northeast. This led to its political reorganization relatively quickly afterwards, with Nagaland granted statehood in 1963 and Manipur and Tripura getting their own legislative assemblies as union territories. But normal relations with China, that took over a decade to resume. Full diplomatic ties weren't restored until 1976.
Okay, shifting focus to another neighbor, Pakistan. The relationship here seems defined by conflict right from the moment of partition.
It was, unfortunately. The dispute over Kashmir erupted almost immediately, leading to a proxy war involving tribal militias supported by Pakistan in 1947, which was then referred to the United Nations. Pakistan's subsequent decision to align itself with the U.S.-led bloc through military pacts like SEATO and CENTO, and its later developing ties with China, made it a critical factor influencing India's relationships with those global powers as well. Everything became interconnected.
So conflict was a constant presence, but the sources also mention moments of cooperation. It wasn't all bad.
It's important to note those, yes. Despite the overarching conflict, there were areas where cooperation was essential and somehow achieved. Both governments worked together, albeit with immense difficulty, to restore women abducted during partition to their families, a huge humanitarian effort, and they successfully resolved a major long-standing dispute over the sharing of river waters through the Indus Waters Treaty in 1960.
Ah, the Indus Waters Treaty. That's still cited today, isn't it?
It is. This treaty, mediated by the World Bank and signed by Nehru and Pakistan's then President General Ayub Khan, has remarkably endured and functioned even through later conflicts. It's quite an achievement, really.
But then came a more serious armed conflict in 1965.
Yes, during the tenure of Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri. It began with Pakistani probing attacks in the Rann of Kutch in April 1965, followed by a larger offensive in Jammu and Kashmir in August-September, codenamed Operation Gibraltar. Pakistan's rulers at the time hoped this offensive would spark a popular uprising in J&K, but that local support largely didn't materialize.
And India responded.
Yes. To relieve pressure on the Kashmir front, Shastri ordered Indian troops to launch a counteroffensive across the international border into Punjab, where the Indian army advanced close to Lahore.
How did that war conclude?
Hostilities ended through intervention by the United Nations, leading to the Tashkent Agreement in January 1966, which was brokered by the Soviet Union. While India inflicted significant military damage on Pakistan, the war added considerably to India's already strained economic situation, diverting precious resources.
And that brings us to the watershed event of the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971. This war was rooted in Pakistan's own deep internal crisis, wasn't it?
It was entirely rooted there. Following the 1970 general elections in Pakistan, the results showed a clear mandate for the Awami League in East Pakistan. But the ruling establishment in West Pakistan refused to accept it. They refused to hand over power or even convene the assembly, ignoring the demands for autonomy and federation that East Pakistan had voted for after years of feeling marginalized and exploited.
And that led to a brutal crackdown.
A horrific one. Yes, in March 1971, the Pakistani army launched a brutal military action in East Pakistan. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the leader of the Awami League, was arrested, and a reign of terror was unleashed on the Bengali population who had voted for change. This sparked the struggle for the liberation of Bangladesh.
And India was directly impacted by a massive refugee crisis.
An enormous burden. Throughout 1971, an estimated 80 lakh, or 8 million, refugees fled from East Pakistan into neighboring areas of India, overwhelming resources and infrastructure. India provided significant moral and material support to the Bangladesh freedom struggle, which Pakistan, predictably, saw as an Indian conspiracy to break up their country.
And internationally, India found itself facing a formidable combination, the U.S. and China backing Pakistan.
Yes, the international alignment was very challenging. Pakistan received political and diplomatic support from both the United States and China. This was particularly significant because the U.S. and China were, at that very moment, undergoing a historic rapprochement, signaled by Henry Kissinger's secret visit to Beijing in July 1971, a visit that actually occurred via Pakistan. This created a potent, if informal, U.S.-Pakistan-China axis that India perceived as a major threat.
And India's strategic response to counter this axis was the Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the Soviet Union.
Exactly. In August 1971, India signed a 20-year treaty with the USSR. This treaty was seen by India as crucial for countering the emerging U.S.-Pakistan-China alignment. It essentially assured India of Soviet political and diplomatic support and implicitly strategic backing in case it faced an attack.
Now, this treaty, with one of the major Cold War powers, didn't that seem to contradict India's core policy of non-alignment? That must have raised eyebrows.
That's a really important question, and yes, on the surface, signing a treaty with the Soviet Union might seem like a deviation from non-alignment.
Absolutely. However, the way it was framed, and arguably how India justified it, was that non-alignment meant not joining military alliances directed against other blocs. This treaty was presented as a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation.
Okay.
Crucially, it provided strategic flexibility and support specifically against the perceived threat from the U.S.-Pakistan-China axis, rather than joining a full military pact like the Warsaw Pact. India argued it was a necessary measure taken to safeguard its national interest and security in an extremely volatile and hostile geopolitical environment, allowing it to continue pursuing its broadly independent foreign policy.
So a strategic move born out of necessity rather than a complete ideological shift away from non-alignment.
That appears to be the interpretation presented in the sources and certainly the context of the time, and it definitely set the stage for the full-scale war that erupted in December 1971.
Which Pakistan initiated, according to the sources. Yes, on December 3rd, Pakistani aircraft launched attacks on airfields in Punjab and Rajasthan, and their army moved on the J&K front. India responded by launching a full-scale retaliation on both the western and eastern fronts, involving the Air Force, Navy, and Army.
And the progress in East Pakistan was incredibly swift.
Remarkably so. With crucial support from the local population and the Bengali freedom fighters, the Mukti Bahini, the Indian Army, made rapid advances in East Pakistan. They surrounded Dhaka within just 10 days, leading to the surrender of the approximately 90,000 Pakistani troops stationed there. A very quick collapse.
Leading quickly to the creation of Bangladesh.
Yes, the swift conclusion of the war led to the birth of Bangladesh as a free country. India then declared a unilateral ceasefire on the Western Front. Peace was formalized by the Shimla Agreement in July 1972 between Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and Pakistan's new leader, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto.
The impact of this war back in India was massive, wasn't it? Politically and psychologically.
Huge. It led to widespread national jubilation. The decisive victory was seen as a moment of glory, a clear demonstration of India's growing military capability, particularly after the stinging defeat in 1962. For Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who led India during the war, her popularity surged significantly, consolidating her political position and contributing to the Congress Party winning large majorities in state elections that followed.
But these conflicts, the wars with China and Pakistan, they must have come at a significant economic cost for a developing nation like India.
Oh, a very significant one. India was committed to planned economic development, but these conflicts, particularly after the 1962 war, meant scarce resources had to be diverted towards defense. India had to invest heavily in modernizing its military, leading to the establishment of specific departments like defense production in 1962 and defense supplies in 1965.
And that impacted the development plans.
It did. This diversion of resources impacted the 5-year plans, notably delaying the launch of the 4th plan. Defense expenditure increased enormously. It was a major drain.
Finally, let's briefly touch on India's approach to the nuclear question during this period. Where did that start?
India's nuclear program was initiated quite early, actually, in the late 1940s, under the scientific leadership of Homi J. Bhabha. Nehru had a strong belief in the transformative power of science and technology for building a modern, self-reliant India, and atomic energy was seen as a key part of his vision for industrialization and progress.
So the initial goal was purely peaceful energy, not weapons.
Absolutely. The stated and initial goal was the generation of atomic energy for peaceful purposes. Nehru himself was strongly against nuclear weapons and was a vocal advocate for comprehensive nuclear disarmament globally. He pleaded for it on international stages.
But the world wasn't disarming. The nuclear club was actually growing, especially with China joining.
Precisely. And a key event was China's first nuclear test in 1964. This development spurred the existing 5 nuclear weapon powers, who were also the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the US, USSR, UK, France, and China, to push for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which was finalized in 1968.
And India's stance on that treaty was quite clear. They didn't sign.
It was. India refused to sign the NPT. India viewed the treaty as discriminatory because it imposed restrictions only on non-nuclear weapon states, while effectively legitimizing and preserving the monopoly of the five powers who already possessed them. From India's perspective, it locked in an unequal global power structure. Nuclear apartheid was a term sometimes used.
Which then set the stage for India's first nuclear explosion, the 1974 test.
Yes, in May 1974, India conducted its first nuclear test underground in Pokhran, Rajasthan. It was officially described by India as a peaceful nuclear explosion, and India reiterated its commitment to using nuclear energy only for peaceful purposes.
Okay, hold on. That sounds a bit, well, contradictory, doesn't it? An explosion, but for peaceful purposes. How do they actually frame that distinction? It seems like a fine line.
It does seem like a fine line. That was the specific framing used at the time. India was trying to demonstrate its technological capability, including its ability to conduct nuclear detonations without abandoning its long-held stance against nuclear weapons and its call for global disarmament. By terming it peaceful, they aimed to differentiate it from military weaponization.
But internationally?
Internationally, many observers remain skeptical, understandably. The sources also provide a little domestic context for the timing of the 1974 test. It occurred during a politically turbulent period in India. There were economic difficulties stemming from the 1973 oil shock, high inflation, and significant ongoing agitations across the country, including a major nationwide railway strike. So the test might also be seen in that light, perhaps a way to boost national morale or project strength.
So even that decision was shaped by both external pressures, the NPT, China's TEFT, and internal realities. Looking back over this whole period, it seems there was a surprising degree of consensus on the fundamentals of foreign policy within India, even across different political parties.
Yes, the sources highlight that. It's quite interesting. Despite the intense political debates domestically on many issues, there was a broad agreement among most Indian political parties on the core goals of foreign policy. Things like national integration, protecting national boundaries, and pursuing the national interest. Foreign policy, surprisingly, remained relatively insulated from the day-to-day party politics, even during wartime or when different parties briefly came to power later on.
And while those early principles set the foundation, foreign policy isn't static, obviously. It has evolved over time.
Of course, it has to adapt. The sources note shifts, like the Janata Party government in 1977 advocating for genuine non-alignment, which implied a critique of what some saw as a pro-Soviet tilt under Indira Gandhi previously. And notably, after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, India began pursuing better relations with China and developing much closer ties with the United States, influenced by the changing global order and, very importantly, economic priorities.
And Pakistan?
Relations with Pakistan, as we know, remain complex. There are ongoing efforts towards peace, dialogue attempts, but persistent issues, especially Kashmir, continue to make it a very difficult relationship.
So, wrapping this deep dive up, what does understanding this complex initial phase really mean for you, the listener, today? Why does this history matter now?
Well, it's crucial because it reveals the foundational principles and the strategic calculus that shaped India's initial path on the world stage. It shows the really difficult international environment it had to navigate and the tough choices it made when its ideals of peace and cooperation clashed with the hard realities of national security and geopolitical power dynamics.
It highlights the enduring challenges facing any nation trying to balance its aspirations with the demands of a complex world. And that leaves us with this rather provocative question, something for you to think about. Given India's deep commitment to ideals of peace, cooperation, and non-alignment right from the very beginning, how do you reconcile those foundational principles with the stark reality that India ended up fighting 3 significant wars in just a single decade between 1962 and 1971? What does that tell us about the forces that truly shape a nation's path on the global stage and the difficult, perhaps unavoidable compromises that sometimes entail? Something to mull over.